Hello friends and welcome. I'm Sara Lihz from Sassy's LLC and I have a fun light up retro card for you today and we're going to do it two ways. This is the Stay Tuned die set from Trinity Stamps and we'll use this TV and light it up. Then I have the Mosaic background die. This is from scrapbook.com and the Woodgrain Texture Die from Hero Arts. In one of our versions, we will create like a living room to put our TV in. Then I designed two sentiments that fit in that television. You can download this as a PDF or as a digital stamp from my Patreon. There's a free membership option. So I'll just link it with the supplies. Then we'll use the world's best foam tape to pop up our card. So there's plenty of room for the star of the show, the easy lights. If you haven't used these before, they are so simple and such a wow factor. So let's go ahead and get started. I printed this out on some vellum. A lot of times I like to print this with my laser printer if I'm printing on vellum because it dries immediately, but I used my inkjet this time. I will say you want to give it a little time. It can smear if you don't give it enough time to dry, but you can use an inkjet for this. I have cut out all of the pieces of my Stay Tuned die set and it just comes together really quickly. There's a single die that cuts out this sort of inner silver piece and then the gray frame for the TV. So you know they're going to nest together perfectly. I started with the silver piece just to make sure that I was getting my sentiment perfectly centered. And then I trimmed away most of the rest of that vellum. I'm going to add glue on what's left so that I can add on this other larger frame for the television. What I didn't do here was then to go back in and trim off the rest of the vellum. This needs to fit inside that very thin black frame. That's actually a solid die, and I use the solid die to cut the acetate. I'm just using the acetate for stability here. Because I have all these separate pieces, I didn't want just vellum to be what kind of holds them all together. So I cut that gray rectangle and then the large rectangle that is the acetate and then sort of this black frame at the same time to get the frame. And then that way it's just a lot stronger. The acetate that I'm using is actually shrink plastic. It is super duty, heavyweight, super ultra clear. And as long as you're not trying to heat it up or heat emboss it, you're going to be just fine. At this point, I'm noticing there is some vellum kind of sticking out all around the edges. Oh my goodness, if I had figured this out before I put the glue on it, you guys, it'd been a little bit easier. But it turns out all right in the end. I will say if you've got any wetness on your hands or glue on your hands, be careful not to touch the ink on the vellum. That can smear it as well. Ask me how I know. So I'm just sort of puzzle piecing that in. And then there is a stand for the TV to go on, but I want two versions of this card. One I will add just onto a standard A2 card base, but one of them is going to be a mini card. I want this guy to stand on his own. So I have a strip of cardstock that's about 3.5 inches, and I have just glued that behind my little TV stand. I pushed it down as far as I could where you wouldn't see it. I did have to trim the corners, but then I can flip the other part over. I just cut it twice, right? So it's an extra strip of cardstock sandwiched in between two of the TV stand pieces. I was even able to keep the sort of nice side of the die cuts facing out because it's symmetrical. Then I will take the excess from that strip of cardstock and glue that onto the bottom of my TV, being careful that it's not going to go above my sentiment. There are two sort of decorative rectangular pieces. They can go on the right-hand side of my television. And one of them, this one, is smaller. I've cut it from silver. And then there are little buttons you can put in the rectangle where I'm about to stamp this. But I wanted a place to put push. Plus the buttons are really small. I'll be honest. If I don't have to put the buttons on, I am 100% going to skip that. So I made a jig, right? I have sort of the negative piece and then my silver piece. And then there's acetate that I put right over the top of it. So I could stamp it once and make sure it's in the right position before I stamp it actually onto my card. It was perfect, except a touch low. So I just trimmed a little bit off of my two pieces of cardstock instead of having to reposition my stamp. And then I will stamp onto that silver cardstock. I'm using StazOn Ink. It's a solvent-based ink, so it will dry on a slick surface. You want something like that if you're going to put this on metallic cardstock or you could heat emboss it, and that would work as well. The rest of the TV comes together really quickly. There is a slightly larger rectangular ovalish piece here that just creates a little frame around the outside edge. I love that added detail, just a little more visual interest. And then I'll glue that onto the right-hand side of my television. You actually can flip this around. You could have it so that that's on the left-hand side. There isn't necessarily a top and a bottom for that television die, so you've got lots of options. Then there is a little circle and then a little dial switch to put on there. It's just a couple of pieces and it makes a huge difference. This whole thing just really comes to life. From here, we can start adding our lights. So here's an easy light. I just stick the battery in and I push the button, and I have 3 small lights connected to wires that I can add to my card. So I am lining up my television, and then I just have another piece of black cardstock that I cut with that largest die, and I'm marking where that push is. Then I'm setting that button and the battery right on top of it and lightly tracing around the outside edge. I like to make it so that you can actually get into where the battery is and replace the battery in case it dies. So I am just freehand cutting, right? I cut in to meet that pencil mark, and then I'll use my scoring tool just to create a little like score line, and I can fold that back. That way, at least my little hatch in the back looks a little tidier than it otherwise might. So I'm double checking and just making sure that it looks right. And then I have some double-sided tape on the back of that battery and button. I removed the release paper, and I'm going to put that onto the flap and make sure that the button is over that little line I drew where push is going to go. Since I've already assembled all my TV die cuts, I grabbed the die so I could mark the corners of the screen, which is where I want my lights to go. So I'm going to separate these very gently. And there is a little yellow bit on the end. The yellow piece is the light itself. So I'm actually angling that light in towards the center. What I'm doing right now is to put the lights directly on top of the pencil marks that I made. Honestly, it's a little too far in. Off camera, I'm going to back these up ever so slightly so that you don't see the light itself quite so harshly. I want the glow without necessarily the light showing. But I'll go in on the 2 top corners and then the bottom middle, and I am just taping my lights into place. I need to tape down the rest of my wires, but I need them to have room for this flap to fold back. So I'm folding the flap and then adding tape on the excess wires so that when I go to open that, it's not going to pull really hard and maybe dislodge something or get disconnected somewhere. Then I can flatten it out and tape down everything else. I will say if you look very closely when you push the button, you can kind of see the wires back behind my TV. So if I was going to do this again, I might stick a little bit of black cardstock over the center where the wires are, but still allowing the lights to show. This is the world's best foam tape from Pear Blossom Press, and it is magical. It takes the stress out of making light up cards or interactive cards or anything where you need to use foam tape. It is double thick, so it's the perfect height for your battery pack. And it's also repositionable. So here I have a little bit too much foam on the bottom, right? It's sticking out. And I can easily lift that up and just trim it away. Not a big deal. You could put this whole thing down and then take it back off. How do I know? Because I did. I told you I backed up those lights a little bit. It was at this point, right? After I kind of looked at it all together and I was like, those are a little too far in. And I was able to move some of that foam tape so I could back them up. I am going around the edges of that foam tape with a black alcohol marker just so that there isn't this stark white contrast when you see it from the side. You certainly could skip that, but then I can go ahead and add the back onto the front and my card is looking great. So the first way I'm going to finish this card is by making a mini card. This is an A2 piece of black cardstock. I folded in half and then I ran it through, leaving one of those long edges of the die hanging out over the top so it didn't cut through that score line. I will just tape this on there, and I have a little mini card now that is the same size as my television attached to the back. I'm adding a little bit of white cardstock as well. It's 3 7/8 by 2.5. I added it with some removable adhesive. And now I have this little mini card that's done. I can easily remove the mini card because I added it with removable tape runner. It's like temporary adhesive. And then I always have access to that battery. For our second way to finish the card, I'm actually going to make a full A2 panel. I love this die from scrapbook.com. I felt like it looked like wallpaper, but because I'm making a masculine card, I decided to do blue on navy instead of blue on white, but I think it would be stunning as like blue on white or white shimmer. Then I will build the rest of my room right on top of it. So this is the Woodgrain Texture Fancy Die from Hero Arts. And I took the shim out of my die cutting machine when I ran this through. All of those little details are actually cut lines, and I didn't want it to cut all the way through. It can make this a little fiddly to work with when it does. So this was perfect. It gave me all of that texture and impression without giving me like tons of strands of wood grain, if that makes sense. To create a baseboard, I have 2 white strips of cardstock. The smaller one is 1/4 inch, and then this larger one is just a hair taller. And I went along one edge with a gray alcohol marker. It looks darker now than it will when it dries. It will create just that extra illusion of shadow since this is just cut paper and not a die cut, so I don't get that soft rounded edge that I sometimes really love in a die cut. And I'm going to line that up right along the top edge of our wooden floor. A little bit of wet glue helps me to wiggle it into place, you guys. I love this room so much. I'm probably going to make a handful of cards that are rooms like this. Here, I took the mini card off the back and I will just add that same temporary adhesive onto the back of my television. And then I can add it right onto my card, but it's the same idea. The television lights up. It's beautiful. You're not old, you're retro. And then I can easily remove that, get into that battery pack if I need to, and then stick it right back down on the card. That temporary adhesive lasts a really long time, so I don't have to worry about that. My friends, I hope this inspires you. I hope that you'll find some fun ways to make funny, light up cards. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, and I will see you next time.